Hey everyone, it's 6:33 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, October the 28th, and they say it's 2022 years from, the birth of Christ. A couple weeks ago I did a video, it was an all-camera video because I wanted everyone to see my face, to see my facial reactions, the sincerity on my face. Concerning this one, I don't think it's entirely necessary. And it's still dark out, which makes it more difficult for the camera to pick up a good image. A couple of things real quick. One, I've had to increase the amount of work that I'm doing professionally. So as a contractor, I'm having to increase that quite a bit. So I haven't had as much time to do research work, any research work, biblical or otherwise. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. That's all. There's just currently no money in the truth. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And I think there's good reasons for that. And if I were to point a finger, that finger would probably be going in every possible direction, including back at myself. But I'm still working on things. Always working on things. Some of the projects that I've had intended to implement, like I was going to do a live stream that was going through the Bible one word at a time. And the reason for live streams, because I've gotten some criticism on that I've made two live streams. One was supposed to be a test, but I did cover the photographs I had taken of the 5 low-head dams on the Grand River in Grand Rapids. But anyways, yeah, I've gotten some criticism about that because I really don't know the technology all that well. I'm not a techie. I spend the vast majority of my time doing just pure, raw research. So all of those things end up coming in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. But the reason for doing that was actually the interaction with the audience so that anybody could type in thoughts that they have. The last one was really good because I had some really good input. So I think that there's a lot of value in that format. It's just going to take some time to get that ironed out. So I was thinking about doing I was going to call it word by word in that format too. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I don't think that that is probably just going to be a productive format for something like that. So what I'll probably do is end up doing that same thing, but just publishing it as part of the Obery Hours. And just go from there. I have to change a few things about the old episodes of the Obery Hours too. So, but their story live stream is going to continue pretty much just one installment about every 4 weeks as I'm able to, which really just comes down to my availability. And the other people that I've invited to participate, they have limited availability too. None of them are necessarily tech experts. That's not why I invited them. I invited them simply because I think they have the ability to think and they would bring something valuable to that discussion. So, right, a couple of weeks ago, I made that tOP briefs entitled, Where Am I? Because so much had changed. I saw like a milestone as when I had produced the Obery Project Presents, bringing it all together. And the reason I saw that as a milestone because I thought that what it was simply an encapsulation of everything that I had learned to that point. What I had learned, what I had believed, based on what I'd learned to that point. And the problem was this. The problem with it from the start And the ongoing problem I have with it, not that I'm going to take it down, not anytime soon. For now, it can stand as literally as a mile marker, and it will be able to be viewed in contrast with what I do going forward. I ended up just really giving the best effort I could, is what it was. Here's the best effort I have concerning all of these topics, which I regard as probably some of the most important topics. But what happened was, as I was even making that, and I'm talking about making it as in the production phases, so the editing the video altogether, you know, putting in text on the screen where text needed to be put in, selecting the appropriate slides, making it look good, making it sound good. As I was doing that, so this is long after I've written, rewritten, rewritten, edited it myself. I think I did the editing. Yeah. And I'm doing this, just the production of it, realizing that there are things about this that I think that I've perhaps gotten wrong. But by that point in time, it's like, well, maybe they're wrong, maybe they're not, but at least for the sake of, you know, like for the record, let's finish it. And that's the case with any single presentation that I've done so far. Every single one of them, I think, needs revision. And if I had the time, I would do that. I would love to do that with every presentation I've done. It needs to be revised. It could use a volume 2, maybe a volume 3. So in the spirit of everything that I've learned, and in consideration of the Where Am I briefs that I did a few weeks ago, this is going to be a brief, again, not based on absolute cold hard fact, because anybody who tells you that they have absolute cold hard facts regarding these topics must be a liar, because I don't know anyone who does. And I think the majority of the people that do have platforms, voices, many followers, are they're either liars or they're simply opportunists. And I'm not sure which one is worse. None of us, I believe, really have the goods on most of these topics. And so what I'm forced to do, because that's the case, is to give you basically a sort of statement like if I were an archaeologist, an honest one, because I don't know that any honest archaeologist exists. Or if I was an honest scientist, like, say, a geologist or something, and I came across a scene that I knew nothing about, and it was of interest because there was a lot of evidence there that something had happened here, you know. Obviously, if you come across anything at a point in time, there have been things that have happened before you got there. But it's a mystery, and it seems that nobody has good information on this. So it seems. So you, if you're honest, you do your best to try to piece everything back together. And oftentimes, if you're honest, you're going to find that you have so many holes, even if you've diligently and patiently, painstakingly pieced everything back together, you still have these huge holes. And one of the valuable things when you reach that point is positing theories. And they're simply theories based on everything that you've put together, that you see as maybe not absolute truth, but as pretty strong theories. And then what you'll often do is you'll often predict. You'll often say, based on everything that I was able to find and study, I predict that if anyone finds anything in addition to what I've been able to find, they're probably going to find blank. And that's one way that you can see if you're on the right track or not. What's interesting is when one of the old presentations that I'd really like to revise when I have time is the land of Amory, because before I ever started noticing this problem with Amory and how it was used to oftentimes describe in general the land, the broader land and the people of the broader land and so on and so forth, I had already looked at every land in the world that was a potentially good place to check to see if that were a land that could fit the descriptions in the Bible. And I mean every land. I was on every continent all over the place for a very, very, very long time. In fact, North America is the last place I looked. And most people who followed me for years, you know that's true. But that was a prediction. A prediction was, before I had even wrote that paper, that if, based on everything else that I'm seeing, I would not be surprised if I found that the land of the Bible was indeed somewhere in North America. And I've had to change where, based on getting a better understanding of directions, which I cover in the Obery Hours, episodes 12 and 13, I believe, to east of the Mississippi. And I've had to start dealing with the fact that some words that are translated as river may not be river whatsoever. Specifically like the N-E-R, ner or ne'er, used from Genesis 2 forward, which are translated as river, might not be river whatsoever, and maybe simply indicating springs or fresh water, large bodies of fresh water. And it's led me more and more to conclude that it's very possible that what we're looking at in these ner that proceeded out of the Gan Eden, or Garden of Eden, were indeed what we experience today as the Great Lakes of North America. It's very possible. Oftentimes these are a combination of what information I can gather and then application. Is there a lot of bias that tends to be clouding my perceptions? Is a good question. And whereas I'm a person who would oftentimes admit if I do have a bias, like I've admitted more times than you can count that I have a bias towards the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, being historically and geographically accurate if we can get to an undisputed, inarguable understanding of what the wording is saying. But I do have biases. But do I believe my biases are affecting my perceptions of geography, time, peoples, tribes, ethnicities? I'm going to tell you that I don't think it is. And why is that? Well, one reason is a lot of people's biases come from simply what they believe in a religious context. I could continue picking on Christian identity and tell you that their bias comes from believing that all whites are Israelites and only Israelites are promised to go to heaven. Now, that kind of bias don't get down too much on, say, Christian identity because they have that bias. That sort of bias is reflected in nearly every religion out there. I'm special because I'm this, and I have to maintain that belief that I'm special because of this. Calvinists in Christianity in general. A Calvinist can be white, black, yellow, red, purple, but they have a belief that they're part of a select people that were selected before the foundations of the world. And they have to maintain that in a religious dogmatism that causes them to have a very unreasonable bias, and it skews everything else that they think of, that they do, so on and so forth. I don't have any of those. I don't have any of those, because here's why. At this point in time, I've come to the point where I've made peace with the fact that I may be nobody, nobody significant, from no significant people, from no significant family. I myself may never be significant in the grand scheme of things. There may not be any afterlife whatsoever, and I may simply die at an appointed time or at a random time, which I'm not sure that is even plausible in reality, but whatever, that I may die and that be the end. That is the complete and total end of my existence, my consciousness, all things that I've ever loved, hated, aspired for, everything aesthetic and beautiful, as well as ugly and detestable about me, ends at that point. It's entirely possible. And I've made peace with that absolute possibility, because a lot of the evidence, based on what we understand from the Old Testament, thus far points to it. I don't need to be somebody from some people important or anything like that, just to be a guy who understands that I have an overwhelming, unending, just continual desire and urge to understand the world, the people in it, the creation, the creator, all of these things. So I think because of that, I can say with a pretty high degree of honesty, and let's leave a little bit of room for just human error, that biases are not adversely affecting outcomes. Now, that being said, a couple weeks ago it was where am I? Today, like an archaeologist or an honest scientist, what happened? What happened? Because that's become a big thing. In fact, I think it was rolled out just like Flat Earth. It was rolled out just like a lot of things have been rolled out. It was rolled out just like the It's the Jews dogma, pre-World War II Germany, and is being rolled out again for anyone who's following Kanye West and others who are, I think, very publicly, very optically saying things like that, and very publicly, very optically paying prices for saying that. I mean, look, if you're talking about people who actually are at the top of the pyramid, they have to be the dumbest motherfuckers that have ever walked the earth to actually go after somebody for criticizing them. You know, this quote from Voltaire, you'll know who's in control based on who you are not allowed to criticize. Bullshit. A smart people allows criticism when it happens, but a smarter people makes sure that they are so invisible, so undetectable and unnoticeable that they never will even get specific criticism. However, what happened? A lot of people are thinking about this. What happened? They're looking at clues. Very few of them seem to be looking at biblical clues in relationship to, for instance, what they may be looking at in clues of structures and earthworks. And sometimes some of them look at linguistic and literature clues. So some of the clues that I'm looking at, because I'm trying to integrate as much as I can the Bible and lost languages, with what little bits and pieces we can know and understand about the world today. Now, literature in general, you can't trust virtually all literature that's out there. Any literature that's going to hit too close to home is not going to enjoy a lot of circulation, not now, not 100, not 200 years ago, not 300 years ago. And if we get into 300 years ago, I think most of the literature from 300 plus years ago was systematically rounded up and or destroyed. So what we mostly have is literature starting in the mid to late 1700s, all written and geared to reflect the world that the regime who were taking control and reforming the world in their image, so the world as it would work best for themselves. They made sure that all of these reference works and fiction works and educational programming works, as far as like required texts in school situations, compulsory schooling, they made sure that all of it was reflecting the world that they were making. I don't think their plans were actually all that complex per se. I think they were relatively simple and straightforward, and I'm sure they had plenty of hiccups along the way bringing this all to pass. I think it's been a few centuries. Now, reaching back to the mid to late 1700s, even that is going quite a long ways, because there's frequently, well, let's say this, maybe it all started happening that far ago, which I know a lot of people would say that's not that far, but I mean, it's a little ways. We're talking about 2-point-something full centuries. And I think that it didn't happen right away, and I think a lot of people had to die, and a lot of new generations had to be programmed, and a lot of people had to die again, and a lot of new generations had to be reprogrammed. And I think this has happened over and over and over and over and over. I think World War I and World War II weren't anything close to the first two world wars, if we want to describe them as many nations and huge amounts of people being in conflict and huge amounts of people dying because of that. And I mean, even they admit this. You can go, I posted a short video at the Obery Project Panoply Facebook group where I scrolled through all of the wars since like 16 or 1700s, all the official wars on record for Holland, or the Netherlands. And the amount of wars that anyone would construe as a world war, if you see all of the participants involved, thus all of the people and armies that had to have been involved, and all the death that had to have been exacted, is gigantic. There were many world wars before World War I and World War II. So if you consider the Bible, and I'm sorry, but for right now I'm going to have to remove the New Testament from that consideration. And here's why, before anyone has too much of a knee-jerk reaction to that. As I said in Where Am I have serious problems with the veracity of the New Testament for many reasons. One of that is it doesn't actually follow the plot of the Old Testament. It doesn't follow the plot of the Old Testament. In fact, there have been many words, terms, and passages changed around in the Old Testament to try to better reflect or make the New Testament material seem far stronger, when in actuality it's not. It simply doesn't reflect well the storyline. There's actually a coherent storyline throughout the Old Testament. So I'm going to have to remove that just for now, because that's not even the bulk of what we are seeing as far as information and prophetic information that we see in the Old Testament. So it really wouldn't matter, even if I really super believed it. We could still do that and look at the trajectory based on the prophets, we'll say the 39 current accepted books, and I am including Esther, even though I don't like Esther. I don't think that's an inspired book whatsoever. I don't even think it was historical. I don't think that ever actually happened. But we'll just include those. Those 39. Take a look at them and look at their trajectory. And one reason I don't like Esther is because it doesn't actually fit the overall trajectory of the rest of the Law and Prophets, the other 38 books. And we see a couple of things. One of the things that we see is length of time as far as the people who Yahweh is dealing with, sending them into captivity or out to be cast away. If we're looking at a 2,000-year gap in the last time he cast his people away, whether you want to see those people as the Jews or Negroes or Native Americans or whites, whoever you wish to see them as, is irrelevant. 2,000 years? 2,000 years is so excessive that you would expect to find something. You'd expect to find something in the Law and Prophets that at least hinted at this gigantic amount of time of a captivity, because there was never, ever, ever anything said in the Law and Prophets as far as at a certain point in time, I'm just going to absolutely do away with you people and take another people as my people or whatever else. In fact, the exact opposite is said over and over in the Law and Prophets, that Yahweh would continue with this people because he made a covenant with them. The covenant is essentially this. It's not because they were awesome or they were better or they were prettier or they were whiter, blacker, browner than anybody else. And I'm simply putting those qualifiers in there just because right now it's a bit irrelevant. He made this covenant so that this people would serve as an example to all the other people around. And if he chose a people that he was going to use to make an example of, but remember, they got plenty in return if they were obedient. They did as he said as part of the covenant which he made at Horeb or Sinai with them. But he wouldn't have even entered into that kind of covenant to make them a public example for good or for bad if he didn't care about all the other people all around them. That's one thing I think that needs to be drilled into people's heads, no matter if they want to believe the Jews or the Israelites or the Germans, some tribe of Negro, or all of them, or whomever. We need to remember that. There would be no purpose in making a covenant where he would make a public example out of a certain specific people, lest he cared about all of the other people around them, which we know he does because he speaks to all of the other people around them through almost every prophet. There are actually prophets from Israel who don't even prophesy to Israel. They prophesy, for instance, give you a good one, Nahum, he prophesies specifically to Ashur, Nineveh, or Nineveh. That's it. That's the only people he doesn't prophesy to Israel. Now, 2,000 years is a long time. It's a really, really long time, eh? So what I would expect is, as information comes forward, is better understood from the Old Testament, through what I believe is right now, maybe somebody will come up with something a hell of a lot better. For right now, the best system we have of trying to understand what the Old Testament actually says is Obri. It removes the Masorah, and it tries to look at all of this as glyphs that are consistent. And there's a way that these words are formed, the ideas are formed through consistent glyphs. So I believe as we get to understand what the Old Testament is saying better, one thing that we'll find is that the last captivity would probably be one of the longest for Judah anyways, Judah, Benjamin, Levi, we know that the rest of the tribes were already captive and had gone for quite some time, but they weren't gone in the sense of forgotten or completely done away with, because the prophets speak to them. They simply were gone out of Yahweh's sight. This is literally the kind of terminology that's used. They weren't any longer in this great choice land, in this great choice abundant land that he gave to all of Israel, all 12 tribes, when he brought them out of Mitzrayim into Canaan. And if you think that's Palestine, you're not thinking. So when you consider, for instance, one of the judgments was to cast away Judah into Babel. For how long? This is right after the time of Jeremiah. And we see this, them being in Babel during the books of Ezekiel and Daniel. And we see them coming back. It's 70 years. Now that is a generation or two, depending, it can be, absolutely, if they're not living long. They come back in the books that we see, like Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah, at least. If not others who prophesied even after them, like perhaps Joel or other prophets that have been misdated. But that was for a lot of offenses, those 70 years in Babel, a lot of offenses. And then we see Zechariah, and maybe Haggai, but definitely Zechariah, prophesying about this country that was going to come. You see, one of the reasons why Judah, Benjamin, Levi came back to the land of Canaan and again occupied a number of areas that they had occupied before is because these two empires that had a certain alliance to them, Paris and Mede, usurped Babel as the reigning power in the land. Before Babel, it was Ashur. That was the reigning power in the land. Then Mitzrayim for a hot minute, then Babel, and then this Paris and Mede come, and they usurp Babel. And remember, these kingdoms, as these turnovers are happening, these kingdoms are taking not only the territories that they had as their home countries, whatever else they had conquered before, but all of the places that the prior kingdom to them had conquered. And the kingdoms are just growing, and they're just growing, and they're just growing, you see. And we leave off with Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, and Haggai, where this Paris, really, because Mede kind of fades. Maybe Mede headed further south and took over a lot of lands to the south. But what Zechariah said was that another nation was coming and that it was going to challenge Paris and Mede and their hegemony, or hegemony, whichever it is, and that they would usurp Paris and Mede. This wouldn't be far into the future. Now, this is where the prophecies just seem to stop. And the reason I mentioned Joel is because Joel has a bit to say about this next empire called Yun. Y-U-N. It is my name, John. That's how they transliterate it into English. It's Yun. So Jonathan is Yonatan. Yun. John. Anybody who's watched Bringing It All Together will know that there's a large section in which I cover where was this Yun. And I talk about the Yohanas as far as there were these little bits and pieces that I would get from these old reference books where they wouldn't necessarily give anything racially, but they would give bits of information. Like, for instance, they would say, well, the aristocrats of India and the eastern parts of Asia or the Orient were called Yohanas, John. That was the basic name they were given. John, as in what? As in Yun. When you travel around to various different languages that all tend to revolve around what they call Proto-Indo-European, which essentially includes Germanic, Greek, which I'm not even sure if Greek wasn't a completely contrived language, but that's neither here nor there, Latin, and possibly Sanskrit. But I'm going to have to take some people's words for Sanskrit because I still haven't had the chance to sort out Sanskrit. I've read some books on from linguists who say that Sanskrit is so similar because it has the similarity of terms. Maybe that's true. Or maybe they just inherited them through a transliterated kind of system. This thing happens all the time. That's how English was invented. You have these people in the Orient, in East Asia, in these countries over there, and they're the rulers, and they're called Johannas. And we see that name, variations of that name, this Ian, Yun, Johan, all over the place. We see it in Japan with these people that are either white or part white called the Ainu. We see it in provinces in China, and like what's their currency is the yen. We see it over and over and over and over, and we see it all over the place in India, like a mofo all over in India. And I would imagine the more that we look into all other countries in East Asia, especially the ones where the greatest amount of resources can be harvested and extracted, we're going to find that again and again and again, this common theme of yun, 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 yun. The reason it's so concentrated in India, probably more than even China, is because of how apt India is and ripe it is for the growth of cotton. You can't grow cotton very well too many places in the world. 3 basic places in the world can grow cotton really well. It's parts of India, it's the Nile Delta, and it's the American South east of the Mississippi. And the textile trade, if you command the textile trade, you command a hell of a lot. And that's not to mention the drug trade, because this Yun and maybe the empires before them definitely were growing shit tons of opium over there too. But the big mistake that I believe I made in bringing it all together was assuming that the kingdoms were based in the Orient, based in East China, the areas along the coast, which is where most of the population of China actually lives, because a lot of China is just kind of shit land. It's desert and stuff, you know. So most of it's really concentrated along the coast. India, Cambodia, Vietnam. I believe one of the reasons that we even had all the wars over in Vietnam, and it wasn't just America. Remember, there were a number of countries, including France, that were over there before. Based on some authentic soldier testimonies, it sounds like one of the biggest objectives over there was to destroy a lot of historical, evidence. Tons destroyed. That's one of the biggest reasons for war anywhere, is to destroy historical evidence. So I think I made a big error in assuming that because I saw Yun everywhere in the eastern part of Asia, because the name Yun or In, Y-N or I-N, In was all over East Asia. And because there's so many, beautiful structures and old rich history over there, one might just assume that there were great empires there. And that's before, that's before I had to start thinking about it. And I had to start thinking about the way that the people, I just call them the regime anymore, because unfortunately I can't tell you exactly who these people are, other than the fact that I believe they are white people. They're white people. They're not Jews. They're mostly a confederacy of white people, probably a number of tribes or clans that have an uneasy but very strong alliance. White people. There's a certain type of transposition that I believe they've used for a long time in making the model that they've created of the world work. One of the ways that this works is in literature. If they want to make it seem like there's been a couple of thousand years of history since the birth of Christ, because that's what that's what everybody in the Western world tends to date from, is right, that birth of Christ. then all they would really have to do is take a number of histories that already existed and only change a few basic things and say, look at all these records we have for all of these countries. Of course all this time has passed. It's not that hard. It's not as hard as some people might think. Okay? The other thing is, we tend to make a lot of assumptions about what technology and techniques that we've had at our disposal for centuries. That's, I think, a great, big, huge error, blunder, and mistake. To assume that they didn't have high-quality, high-res cameras centuries ago, it's a big mistake. To assume that they didn't have what we call computer systems today to do a number of things centuries ago, I believe that's a big mistake to make assumptions like that. It's a huge error. When you consider the fact that there's not a great amount of complexity to the development of photographic film. I'm not saying the machines that do these things are not complex, but people and the people who have made them have been complex people since the beginning of their existence on Earth, lest you wish to believe in some sort of Darwinian evolution, which my humble opinion of Darwinian evolution is that it is the zenith of retardation. But even if you wanted to believe in that, we absolutely have been advanced enough for long enough to assume that we could easily have had these technologies, if not more, and not necessarily different technologies where, you know, somebody like the earwig comes along and he says that all of these buildings with columns and pillars and everything are electrical reception devices for shit in the air. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about technology. What we see today, maybe minus the fact that we are dependent on these gasoline, diesel, things like that, which I think is the real problem with a lot of our technologies today. Not that it's used, but that we're so dependent on it and not other things. So, big mistake just to assume that we didn't have those things a long time ago. When I think about the transposition, so if somebody wants to cover their tracks, they were in a certain place at a certain time, but they went by another name. What they might do is, when they change all of the history a couple of centuries ago, they might decide to put other names on it. Let's say empires were in America and they built here, they had influence here. There was too much about their presence here that couldn't be hidden, you see. So they couldn't necessarily erase it, but what they did is they tried to see as far down the road as they could. And they said, well, it's not going to add up if we just say no one was here or one empire was here or whatever. Probably the best thing to do would be just to put in place of the biblical empires with their biblical names being in certain places. We'll say that these other empires, and we'll give all of our countries different names that seem to reflect the slave populations, as well as other the populations who were there before they brought so many slaves in. Slaves from Israel, slaves from Judah, slaves from Odin, slaves from Ashur. Okay? There's a lot of different people that tend to be in these empires. And I'm speaking specifically of white people because that's the center of where all of these changes happened, was in Europe a few hundred years ago. So they would say, what I think is just the safest way is not only will we change the names of these countries, we'll go underground. We will have the monarchies either seem to fall via a people's revolution, or they will simply be benevolent and give democracy to the people and disappear from sight. We'll also rename all of these lands to appear more like the people. So now Parizak, which was part of Paris, it's now Poland. They kept Phrygia in the Netherlands. Germany was a conglomeration of states, including Hanover and Saxony and Bavaria. The Netherlands was once Batavia and other things. These things were changed. And I have a strong strong suspicion that England had a different name too, and I don't mean Albion. Different name. But I think a lot of these places were changed to seem like they were a reflection of the common people. And they did this around the time that they gave them democracy, either by a revolution, typically a faux revolution as far as I'm concerned, because of who ended up usually dying in these revolutions, which were the common people more than anything else ever, or in their benevolence to just give democracy to the people. So they superimposed themselves on history, so that when people saw their footsteps, their tracks in architecture, in literature, in whatever they may have left there, because I think that was one thing they were concerned about, was perhaps the finding of many artifacts or people tracing them being in certain places, specifically the place that was the most sensitive, that they didn't want the people that they were sending back there as slaves, though they were going to reprogram them to believe that they lived in a democracy or a republic and they were free and they could vote and so on and so forth. They did not want them to trace back the real history, who had really been there and what had really become of them. So they superimposed one name and one chunk of time over another that was a very similar chunk of time. Same people, different name. Now I say all of that so that I can tell you who I believe was at least in America, and I'm going to clarify about the Orient or East Asia. And this is just my sincere best guess based on all the evidence or theory at this point in time. So let's do it. Okay, so who are the white European powers or nations that anyone could assume could be most readily tied to, because of history, tradition, artifacts, architecture, you name it? Who are the big ones, big European powers that could most be tied to specifically North America? And I'll work my way from there at least to the Orient. Well, we know that the most predominant ones that we could tie in here would be, for instance, one of the oldest, they would tell us, were the Scandinavians or the Vikings. They would say that's one of the oldest white peoples from Europe to come over here. And they would oftentimes include with that certain Celts. And when they say Celts, they would probably more likely mean the Scots, but definitely Swede, Norwegian, people like that. More Scandinavian, which I believe are a people that are quite different than what they called Germanics. And I have a ton of reasons ethnologically to believe that. And I don't believe that their language is specifically Germanic. I think it has some resemblance. And I think there's reasons for that I probably won't go into in this video. Vikings, Scandinavians, right? Then we would probably have very strong influence from basically Spanish, Portuguese. And you know, while I'm doing this, I really should, because this is going to make it easier though. I do hate the assumptions that this brings up. It would be better for me to bring up Google Earth Pro just in case I need to point out a more high resolution image of something. Anyways, so what we would call, like, let's say just those Mediterranean, those West Mediterranean empires, Spain, Portugal, Italy, okay? And then, of course, Northern European empires, more like France, maybe parts of the Netherlands, perhaps Prussia, but definitely Northern Europe. And we would just call it, I guess, France. We would see them in the historic schema, and we might be seeing them most specifically in, again, evidence, facts on the ground that may be found. Another one, and this is the one that I've been wrestling with since bringing it all together, that most definitely would have a whole boatload of evidence here in North America, would be England or the UK, we'll say the British Empire if we want to, and the Netherlands, the Dutch. And that's a real tricky one, to say the Netherlands and the Dutch. It's always tricky. When you start identifying a people by a land or language, it's really muddy, seedy territory you're getting into. Because, for instance, not all of the people that claim to hail from, let's say, the territories of the Netherlands are ethnologically the same or even sometimes similar. Same goes for Germany. Same goes for England, Ireland, Scotland, France. There are peoples in France that are remarkably different one from another, and we're talking about white people. So I know that's tricky, but I'm just giving you general broad strokes concerning empire. One that you would have a hell of a hard time hiding their presence over here, their influence over here, would be England. And then the Dutch. Now, how does this work? The way I figure it works is like this. There was, for a long time, a couple of large empires in North America towards the eastern part of North America. You see, there's no place I'm aware of in North America or maybe on Earth that is as utterly rich, and we're talking about sheer concentrations of richness, of mineral deposits, of lumber, of fresh water, therefore lushness, of vegetation like you wouldn't believe, than the Great Lakes area. I think this whole area is probably one of the most coveted regions on Earth, hands down. And I believe that two empires sprung up from this area, and don't get me wrong, there's plenty of areas in the United States that are magnificent areas to live in because they are very lush in fresh water, like Missouri. Missouri, they say, has more springs than any other state in America, but I suspect that's because they haven't looked under the Great Lakes. However, it's a wonderful place. It truly is. And many of the states along the eastern seaboard of the United States, full of riches, coal, other minerals, lush lands, fresh rivers. There's more fresh water, not just the Great Lakes. There's more fresh water. The freshwater system in America is unparalleled the world over. Nothing, no land in the world has the abundance of fresh water and a freshwater system that waters the land like the east of the Mississippi, eastern United States, and then most specifically the Great Lakes. And the amount, for instance, the amount of iron ore that comes from the ranges up in the UP and in Minnesota and Wisconsin are mind-boggling. The purity of the iron there and the abundance of it. It's so frickin' abundant up there that they've had to close down shit tons of mines up there under, in my opinion, false pretenses that they just weren't valuable anymore. Though, if you look at the rocks that still are there, they look so iron rich, it's just unbelievable. But anyways, value, man. If you have the largest stores of iron, and let's say that civilizations all around the world know how to work iron, how to make steel, how to make different steel products, different alloys with iron, they would covet this place like you wouldn't believe. Coal deposits. Coal, you need coal. You need coal to make iron. You need limestone and dolomite. Limestone and dolomite quarries all over the eastern U.S. I mean, huge limestone and dolomite quarries. That's why the biggest Portland cement plants in the world are still in the eastern seaboard of the U.S. Now, they say some have surpassed it, but not because they can't pull more limestone out of these quarries. It's simply because they are trying to ruin this place to a certain point, to make us weak, so that they can replace us with other people who I think they believe, first off, will be no competition to them whatsoever, and they believe can do the jobs that need to be done so that they can keep things running and they can stay in control, these certain whites, and they won't have any competition from the other whites. Two empires. One may have been further east and a little further north. That would have been Ashur. And I believe what Ashur became known as, in the new history written, was the Vikings. Ashur was, according to the Bible, a very prolific slave trading people who brought a number of the Israelites, because it's Ashur who carried away the 10 northern tribes of Israel and brought them where? They brought them, as the Bible puts it, and as it's transliterated, to Chala and Kabur and the cities of the Madi, which I believe is parts of France, Spain, and perhaps Portugal. Now, the thing that happened to the northern tribes of Israel was called the Galais, or Galut. And who are the people that appear? Well, they say much longer ago, which I think was only centuries ago. They just appear out of nowhere in France and Spain and Portugal and other parts of Europe. Who is it? The Gauls, who they later started calling Celts. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the Chala from the Bible was the great French port of Calais. And there's actually a port near there, which is like Havre. It's called Havre. I think it's Havre. There are areas like the certain wine areas in here that echo the names of Madi. That route, Madi, is all over middle to southern France and down into Spain. We even see it in Madrid. We see it in what? The Mediterranean. This whole area is the Mediterranean, the earth of the land of Madi. Okay? Madi was a savagely brutal people. They were probably the tip of the spear in bringing down Babel and all of the empire that Babel occupied in North America, which I believe was actually most of the northern and northern eastern seaboard, a very huge area that they occupied. So Ashur, I believe, became the Viking or Scandinavian. And perhaps those people, the Swedes, Norwegians, so on and so forth, maybe the Scots as well, and others, are still the descendants of those same people. Remember, Israel is oftentimes accused by Yahweh of worshiping and whoring themselves mentally, and maybe in other ways after Ashur, because they were often described as these beautiful men that they idolized. And does the Scandinavian not fit? Babel, I'm still not absolutely sure of, to be honest with you, but Ashur. Because Babel, I don't know how much they were dealing in worldwide slave trading like Ashur was. Who do they say were one of the oldest white slavers in Europe? Was the Vikings, right? They constantly have to cover their track by what? Superimposing a new, changed, sanitized history over the old, actual, real history. After Ashur, after Babel, Babel fell to an onslaught first from Midi. So if we figure armies from areas of France, Spain, maybe Portugal, and Italy composing Midi, and then followed up by maybe areas of France, what we call the Netherlands or Frisia, and Prussia becoming who we know as Paris, that occupied for a very long time. And then in the days of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah, Paris and Midi are overtaken by a nation called Yun. So this is what brings us back to my mistake with the Orient, or East Asia, and Yun. I certainly believe that Yun had for a very long time colonies all through East Asia and India, but that was not necessarily their homeland. I have a number of reasons for believing that. Now, what I found was interesting is I started thinking, okay, well, if that's the case, where would the homeland of Yun be? Are there any clues about this Yun? You see, Yun in Daniel, it said that there would first be a great horn, or like a great king of Yun. And after him, for whatever reason, the empire would split and become sort of four, that there would be four horns to this empire. And that in that there would be a smaller horn within that would sort of run that whole empire, and that they would really take over the world, and that they would actually be the first empire to begin this idea of ruling through deceptive means. Now, they wouldn't perfect it. The empire that came after them, which exists to this day, who I think have implemented a lot of the deceptions that sort of run the world, they were the ones who I think perfected it. But this was an empire that started it. And I thought, well, can I see an empire that has four distinct parts, that even has a history, tradition of being four parts in one? Can I see an empire that has any sort of clues that they might have been referred to as Yun, Ian, John, Johannes, something like that? And of course, there was always that loose, hanging, gigantic thread of the presence of Great Britain in North America. What I started finding was some very interesting things about Great Britain, or England. For instance, if you divide the name England up, the latter part of it, Gal Lanud, so certainly it could have been named after the slave class of the Gauls. Lanud actually means to be cast out, Lanud. Gaul, captivity. Lanud is like a wandering, like we see with Cain in Genesis 4, that he would be exiled to the land of Nod. That wasn't actually a land, but wandering in a sense. Lanud, Nud. Gal Lanud, but the first part of it is En, or in Gal Lanud, England. We also see that this mighty empire, the UK, was spread all over the world more than any other empire before it. We also see that the UK proper is divided into four parts, four kingdoms, four duchies, if you will, which, where did that, the application of Dutch and duchy and duke and duchess come from? Makes it interesting when we think of the Dutch. And again, don't think of every person who identifies as Dutch as what I'm saying about the Dutch, or, you know, the Netherlands or anything like that. What was the traditional flag of England for a long time? It was the four segments, called what? Union Jack. Now, one of the and you know that Jack is simply another name for John. It's actually said to be a truncation of John, but it's always associated with John, the Union Jack. Now, of course, the propagandists, like British Israelism or the Christian identity people, will tell you that that actually means the union of Jacob. But I'm telling you, I believe it means the union of Yun, John, the Union Jack. 4 segments in one, Union Jack. We also know that around the world, it's common to refer to someone from England as a John or a John Bull. Now, if it's common to refer to them as Johns or John Bull, wouldn't also the inhabitants of East Asia or the Orients refer to them as Johannes, Johns, John Bull? I think they occupied there for a very long time. In fact, they very wisely overlaid their history after France. Then there was England in the Orient, and specifically in where? India. Inde was simply named after them, these areas, their colonies. Now, how the changeover happened from England to whomever it was that climbed up and usurped their authority, I'm not sure. All I know is that towards the end of all of that superimposed, overlaid history, we see, I think, one of the most unlikely little countries gain an enormous amount of power to where they're absolutely rivaling the sort of commerce being conducted in human flesh and drugs and valuable commodities and so on and so forth. And this, of course, is the Netherlands. Now, is the Netherlands that little horn from Daniel 7? I don't know. I know that there are some people who study, for instance, monarchies, that believe that nearly every European monarchy of today can be traced back to the some or another royal family of the Netherlands. We have a very, very strong so-called Dutch influence in North America. And it's strange, it's bizarre to me how many Dutch companies you can find in some of the most profitable industries the world over. Now, saying these things doesn't make me hate anyone who's old English, not maybe brought in slaves, because I'm sure there's various ethnicities of whites in the UK, as well as in the Netherlands, as well as in Germany and France. And I know I'm being redundant, but I'm really trying to make sure that this isn't misunderstood. Doesn't make me necessarily hate these people. It makes me have a lot of disgust for the way that the world is run by deception. I find that revolting. I do. As much as I'm sure that the people that are running the world are probably very intelligent people, and I'm sure they probably regard themselves as extremely civilized, and I'm sure they regard their system as really the best way to do things. In fact, maybe by this point in time, they're so deluded as to believe that there's really no other system other than theirs that could manage the whole of the world and all the people's resources and so on and so forth outside of theirs. And maybe that's their justification for doing things the way that they're doing. Maybe that's their justification for killing off so much of their competition. And who's their competition? There's only one kind of people that are their competition, you know. If you look out in the wild, if lions are the king of the jungle, the only competition there is for that lion is lions. Now, I'm removing man from that situation. I'm just giving you a good illustration. You have to regard the competition of the people that are ruling the world as people that are similar to them. So that is precisely what I believe was done, is that these empires, as we know them today, as the Vikings or the Scandinavians, then the Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, then the French, Hollanders, Frisians, Prussians, and including Parizak, which is Poland. That's part of Paris, Prussia, Parizak, maybe Frisia, and parts of France. They probably redrew borders that were very confusing borders, and that's why there's been so many problems with ethnicities in many of these areas, because new borders were drawn. They changed the world. They changed the whole damn world in ways to where no one that they re-educated would ever be able to recognize the place. None of what I've said, because I'm going to wrap it up. I'm at 1 hour, 11 minutes. None of what I said is necessarily said to try to demean anyone, any people whatsoever, as though I think I'm from a better people. Nothing like that at all. Except perhaps for the people who currently are ruling the world, who are doing it all through deception and murder, blood. These people rule by deception and blood. And for that fact, I can't respect them, because they would never like men offer themselves to come out and meet one of my people on an open battlefield, like, say, David and Goliath, or anybody else who a champion met a champion, or an army met an army. And the outcome of that decided who would be the architects of their future from that point forward. I don't believe these people have the decency to do that. And for that, I absolutely disrespect them. And I'm sure that there's many things about them that is commendable in as far as their, as I said, their intelligence, ingenuity, their ability to very carefully rule an entire world. I mean, that does take at least talent. And I'm sure there's many things about them that are decent, but I think there's more about them that's indecent in my eyes, because of the way they go about things. I find them indecent. Now, the thing was, I'm sure I had a few more things to say about all of that, but all of a sudden I drew a blank. So, there is everything as I stand right now, and these are broad strokes concerning what I believe has happened based on everything I know about the Bible and everything I've observed about history and the world around me. And so with that, I'm going to wrap it up here at 1:14, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.